real leadership is about becoming yourself through knowing who you are, right? And that's like our focal point when we are trying to help veterans and their families understand like their identity and how that impacts their reintegration.
Hello, this is Tab Bartley, and you are listening to the Oath We Took podcast, the show that tells the Marine Corps story through the Marines that served. I'm joined today by Josh Stanwitz. He is the reason for this podcast. I know so many amazing Marines who hesitate to tell their stories. Their stories hold so much power and so many life lessons. Oftentimes, though, they go untold. Not every Marine story is the same. What is the same is the oath we all took. Josh, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. And every time I do the podcast, we start with the same question, which is why did you decide to join the Marine Corps? And oftentimes I'm just like amazed with I don't feel like it's a question that I think about or we think about enough when we're telling our stories. I think we, go to the boot camp story or the good, the bad, the ugly, and all that type of stuff. So why did you decide to join the Marine Corps?
Oh man. Battle of the services when it came to me. I knew I was going to enlist. It kind of boiled down to what branch. I initially, joking aside, I initially thought Air Force. I'm an Air Force brat. My dad retired in 79 with a little over like 25 years of service. And then I have both grandfathers. I had a grandfather in the Navy, like World War One era. My other grandfather uh, was a paratrooper in the Army with jumps in the Pacific. A lot of people don't know about the Army's role in the Pacific, which is jokes there for days. But yeah, so I came from a very generationally heavy family in the service, and I used to joke when I would speak publicly that we were kind of like all conscripted from the womb. Um, like we didn't have a choice. It was just kind of like one of those things we knew that's what we were going to do. And as I got into high school, I don't want to say like every young kid, but I'll date myself. I turned 44 in like a month. So, as a kid of the 90s, mid to late 90s, um, you know, um, there it was, I mean, I don't, like I said, it was a different generation. We didn't have all the video games and all of that stuff. So like really your exposure to the military or that community came from like the movies or like said cheesy movies at that point in time. Your family members, if they were there. And I was blessed. I grew up in a small community in the mountains of southwestern Virginia. So I mean, like all the men in that community have practically served, right? Which is very common in like the South, blue collar or blue collar rural areas, very common. Um, so yeah, it just kind of boiled down to what branch, and my dad was pushing the Air Force. Um, as a young like teenager, I was reading like all the Vietnam, like LERP and like Recondo and like Recon and like Navy SEAL books and stuff. And I initially had intended to go into. I wanted to try out for buds, and the SEAL recruiter. I mean, I don't remember the guy's name to save my life, but you'll get the reference. Was a very like stereotypical like fat chief, like from back in the day. Um,
Yeah.
and like he's trying to sell me on the SEAL teams, and I'm like look at this dude. And you know, probably a couple of weeks later, um, at the high school lunchroom, the Marines were there, like looking, just strapped, like, in their dress blues. And I started BSing with them. And, you know, recruiters have a totally different relationship with poolees. You figure that out like after you go to boot camp, right? Um,
Yeah.
but, um, but having said that, my recruiters were cool. And, they were like, well, we have something similar to the SEAL teams. It's like recon. It's this and this and this, and that kind of started my venture into the Marine Corps thing. And then long story short, or longer, whatever. It ended up coming down to like my Marine recruiter and Army recruiter kind of getting into, we can offer you this, we can offer you that. And, my grandfather being a paratrooper kind of started to push me toward the Army side. And, at the end of the day, I ended up choosing the Marine Corps. I'm one of two Marines in my family out of, you know, tons and tons of men that have served. And, that's with my mom's family going back almost to the Revolutionary War, and my dad's family going back to World War I. So it's kind of unique. I get a lot of shit, per se, from other people. But, you know, uh, a good friend of mine who's a coastie, he's a retired Coast Guard officer, made a statement to me, and it's kind of true. I've been in the veteran space for over a decade now, and I served off and on from like '98 to 2016. Um, it's people kind of find, for the most part, people kind of find where they're supposed to go, right? Like branch wise. For the most part, people that are supposed to be in the Marine Corps end up in the Marine Corps, and people that are supposed to be in the Army, etc. But yeah, so that's kind of how I chose. And at that point in time, I was obsessed with recon, and like everybody else, like every kid, like, oh, I'm going to be like super high speed. And I was in the recruiter's office, flipping through a leatherneck magazine. Before cell phones. I'll date myself even further. And there were these really cool dudes in flight suits with like balaclavas on, clearing like doing VBSS, vessel boarding search or visit boarding search and seizures, maritime operations assaults. And I was like, who the hell are these guys? And the recruiter was like, this is Fast Company. Like they fall under security forces, but your chances of going to them are slim to none at the time because it was only, I think it was 10 platoons total in the Marine Corps or something.
Yeah.
And I was like, I want to do this, like this is the, F like being in the jungle, like I want to run around in a flight suit and look like Steven Seagal,
Yeah.
like an under siege. And, you know, super small world. That's what I ended up doing, I'm infantry by trade, and he ended up fixing my contract to get me a security force slot. So, you know, that kind of led me into, the units and stuff. I went into the Marine Corps after that, right? So yeah, pretty interesting. But
See, and that's so cool because most often, at least the stories that like I've been doing with the podcast, it's like people come in and they're like, I want to do this. And it's like, well, the Marine Corps needs you to do this, where there's no slots. Like for the most part, it's really rare that like people kind of get what they wanted to get.
so I could have got, I mean, I could have gotten the proverbial Marine Corps shaft, joking aside, um, for the vetted listeners, the green weenie per se, right? Like I could have gotten that. My I went in with a friend of mine from high school, and really good dude. He just retired as a correctional officer out of Indiana, like 2 months ago. But anyway, um, I was like selling him because nobody had served in the military in his family since like his grandparents, right? Like the greatest generation, World War II. And, we're from this like little small, like hillbilly town. And I'm like, I grew up with like, hearing these, I don't want to say delusions of grandeur, but like all of these great stories from, well, my dad, my mom, because my mom lived overseas, right? Like
Yeah.
all of these amazing stories from like the Air Force side of the house, like actually living and residing in Europe for over a decade, and, moving all around. And, so like growing up in this like weird cultured household with that, I was always like trying to push my friends, and my friends were kind of obsessed. So I probably helped those recruiters get like a lot of numbers in like our areas, right? But I went in with my buddy Will, and he wanted to do the same thing I wanted to do, and he had the ability to basically kick my contract. to like boot me out of like my slot. And he told me like on the way to school one day, he was like, I figured you'd kill me. So like I just took like motor T or something, you know. But yeah, pretty funny. Pretty funny. To your point. Yeah, pretty
That
funny.
see that is and see mine's different because I went in public affairs where at the time you had to interview for public affairs. It was like one of the few jobs you had to have multiple
Mm,
interviews for to get. So
cool.
I didn't even realize until later in the Marine Corps that like people weren't getting like what they asked for or like that it was changing. And I would say later, I would say like, boot camp when you realize like you have those conversations. So I just think it's cool. It's just it's cool to see that like, the different journeys and stuff. And so
Open contractors, like you meet a lot
yeah,
of open
that's
contractors.
yeah.
And I
And
was like,
that's
man, I mean,
who I
imagine,
personally couldn't do that.
well, yeah, but imagine being at a point in your life that you want to get out of it so bad that you're just like, I don't care what job it is.
And I fully understand how people
Yeah,
do
yeah,
that.
for
I
sure, for
just,
sure. No, I couldn't
I,
do it either.
yeah, I was like, it was public affairs or nothing. Which, granted,
Cook, cook,
if I
cook,
had, yeah, if
right?
I hadn't have got that, like, I can't say that I wouldn't have, like, they still wouldn't convince, they probably would have, to something else. Cause,
Fair.
it's the intangibles of why people join the Marine Corps. Because as somebody who
Hmm.
sees the other services, I mean, your benefits are essentially the same. Now, what jobs you can find in that, yes, are different in the services, but it's really those intangibles that ends up selling you on the Marine Corps.
Yeah, and I mean, man, you know, when you kind of tell people, oh, back in the day, right? Because I mean, essentially speaking, I am like the old core, now, right? So, but like, when I tell people about enlisting pre 9/11, like, yeah, I think I originally enlisted as in the delayed entry program in like 96 or 97, right? So that like to date myself even more. But, you know, it's branches could be more selective, right? The criteria was like harder because you didn't have the push to fill bodies or to fill various MOSs or, critical needs of the military at that point in time. They were downsizing still kind of at that time, right? Um, and then, you were, I mean, it was just like a weird and kind of interesting time to be in, that era going into, well, 9/11, and
And
post 9/11.
And I know we haven't like really talked about your Marine Corps career yet, but that brings up the when you enlisted in the Army because you joined the Army after leaving the Marine Corps and then being in the civilian sector. Was that post 9/11 when you joined the Army, or were you in the Army
Yeah,
post
yeah.
9/11?
Oh,
Okay.
yeah, for sure, for
Okay.
sure.
So then there's a lot of comparison that we can talk about of like how different it was even like that process post 9/11. Like you're somebody who actually went through it and can say how different it was and see how different it was.
Yeah, wild. I was joking, me, yeah, I have some, brothers from both sides of the branches. I was talking to one of my really good army buddies, and you know, it's uh, it's weird when you kind of look back because I went through the uniform changes and regulation changes of the Marine Corps, right?
Yeah.
From Woodland and Spitshine to Digis and Deserts and etc. And was actually involved in testing some of the uniform products. Um, and then in the Army, same thing. I went through one, two, like three different like uniform types in the Army. So it's kind of weird, but yeah, I mean it's wild being in. And I have I'll tell you a really quick funny story. When I went over to the Army, and I don't want to like throw your uh, order off by any means, but when I went into the Army, um, my first leader, like direct leader, squad leader, I would say, and I'm learning to do the Army side of the house, right? So like, I mean, it's culture shock. He's from Ranger Bat, really cool guy. We were really close, and um, he was just like always was just like kind of giving me grief on. I would get like really excited over some piece of gear that like we didn't have in the Marine Corps, and then he would laugh and be like, well, "That's garbage. Like that's like our fourth generation stuff in the Army still." So yeah, it was like weird little things like that that kind of made you appreciate one branch, I would say, over the other, but not as much as the other, if that makes sense. So
No, it does. And so you were in the Marine Corps for 4 years. Can you kind of like give an overview of like what you did in the Marine Corps and then like your what led you to exiting the Marine Corps?
yeah, sure. So I mean, very standard. You'll probably laugh. It sounds like a cliche movie, but so in the Marine Corps, I was initially a rifleman by trade, so 311. Because I had a security force contract that made me an 8152 after I went through basic security guard school, which is in Chesapeake, Virginia. They call it like gunslinger course or whatever, but it's a cool little 8-week course. Um, I don't want to beat up security force guys too much. They get like some really cool schools, but um, it's almost a version, I would say, of like the embassy course, just not, just a
Okay.
little bit different. And I mean, you're getting qualified on shotgun systems, you're getting qualified on pistol systems, submachine gun systems. And then these are the guys that they're using to protect like either various nuclear weapons or nuclear facilities or spy planes, um, or go to fast, which is like a totally different thing now. But anyway, so yeah, I 0311 by trade, 8152. And then from there, so after gunslinger school, and I'm an East Coast boy, so I went to PI, Paris Island,
Yeah.
Camp Geiger, Camp Lejeune for infantry school, and then Chesapeake, Virginia, for gunslinger school. And then I got stationed in Norfolk, right there at Camp Allen, right near Little Creek, in Damnick with First Fast Fifth Platoon. So that was late '90s, early 2000s, so like pre 9/11. I was blessed enough to do like a few deployments with those guys. So we deployed. Technically, it's a stateside deployment. We did a refuel defuel mission in Hawaii. We also did one in Puget Sound. So, it's where they bring in the submarines and they pull out like the uh, big new uranium rods for the nuclear reactors that fuel them,
That's wild.
and put them in. Yeah, it's funny because it's a big deal. Like it's you're authorized to use deadly force on like all kinds of personnel, and it never happens, but uh, it's interesting because you have like a whole bunch of Marines that like kind of just basically are like effing with like the sailors on the post like the whole time that are near there. But it's cool. So like we did that in Washington and Puget Sound, like and then also in Hawaii and Pearl Harbor, which was like amazing and total blessing. We had a really cool officer, Captain Petrucci, um, and much to our platoon sergeant's dismay, he worked with MWR. And while we were in Hawaii doing the mission, um, if we didn't want to get our our rest from post, we were getting certified through Patty. And I mean, what like how much of a cooler spot to get certified than like in Hawaii? And it was a unique position because he wanted us to go on the mission, but we still had to prep for a Middle Eastern operation that we were going on in support of Operation Southern Watch in a few months. So we still had to get like our training, and you know how the Marines are, you got to like check your boxes, etc. So the whole time we were in Hawaii doing this mission and rotating in and out, we were constantly in and out of like Schofield Barracks, K Bay, etc. Just doing really cool training operations. We got to play with explosives and kind of like learn how to make like homemade explosives with like Marine Corps EOD. Um, and Marine Corps has an awesome EOD program for those of you that are unaware. So we got to like work with those dudes. We got to do like this really cool dog handler workup to where like you put on the bite suits and like they sick the dogs on you and stuff. And that's because we at that point in time we were one of the units that was working with handlers all the time. Like you. It's weird when you think about it in context because now 20 plus years into the global war on terror, you know entry control points and all of these things have become so standardized in military operations. People were like, oh, you got like, who cares? But back then it was so foreign. Like
Yeah.
the anti-terrorism concept was so foreign. That's why you had specialized units that did it.
The Oath We Took podcast, hosted by Marine Corps veteran Tab Bartley, tells the Marine Corps story through the Marines who served. While every story is unique, the common bond is the oath they all took. Tune in Mondays at 5 p.m. Eastern on Wreaths Across America Radio to catch these engaging conversations. Tab is also supporting the Military Women's Memorial through her Wreaths Across America sponsorship page. For every veteran's wreath you sponsor at wreathsacrossamerica.org/The Oath We Took, $5 will go directly to the Military Women's Memorial, the leading memorial and education center honoring the commitment, contributions, and experiences of servicewomen. Once again, to donate, go to wreathsacrossamerica.org/The Oath We Took.
So yeah, it was cool. Like we got to do like all these really cool schools. We had cross training with the British Royal Commandos. So, going back and forth to Lympstone, England to do that, them coming back and forth to Norfolk or Damnick to train with us. And then on top of that, we did, because we were right there, we did a lot of training with the SEAL teams and like the recon elements. So, most of the time we were OP4 for like ST3 or the STs that were right there, or they doing it with us. And that was fast. And then that led to a really cool Middle Eastern deployment. Where we were based out of Bahrain, but we were operating in like Saudi and Qatar and Yemen and all over the place. And, to kind of give you an idea of the time frame, as soon as I got back from that, we were prepping to go to the fleet, and that's when the USS Cole was bombed.
Okay.
And it was our unit, not my unit, well, my unit, but not my platoon, that flew into the USS Cole to secure it, right? Because that's what we specialized in at the time. So yeah, so that was fast. And then I went and did my big boy time, as they call it, in the Fleet Marine Force, because fast was such a small unit. At that point in time, we were 5 platoons. When we got back, and we were essentially like the senior platoon, because the Marine Corps likes to add senior to stuff. To make you feel saltier. But when we got back, we were the senior platoon, the platoon that had like the most senior dudes, the guys that were going like on rotations to the schoolhouses and stuff. And they just added an additional platoon to first and second fast, which was second was based out of Jamestown. And there's huge stories between the two. That's probably a totally different podcast unto itself. But yeah, so we got back from there, got back from leave, and because we were infantrymen by trade, like O3s, you do your fleet marine time. So you go from this really small unit, and I remember our captains were telling us too, because FAST was fairly elite. We were one of 3 units that the commandant was briefed on at the time. It was us, the MUSOC, and Force.
Yeah.
So it was kind of cool because we had like a different budget. We got like different toys. Like we had fully auto M4s before anybody else, and we're like running MP5s and stuff. But because of that, you had like really rigorous standards. So I compare it to almost like the Army's version of Ranger Bat, where you had like really, really hardcore like haircut regulations, and on top of the insane regulations that already existed at that time in the Marine Corps, right? It was like another notch above. So it was like this level of being disciplined. And, everybody was like, oh man, this is terrible. Like all the inspections and all of this shit all over the time, excuse my language. And they go, anyway, point being is when we went to the fleet, you had a lot of people that were relieved. And then you have like your captain and your platoon sergeant that are like, you guys are going to learn. Like how good you had it here. Because Fleet Marine Force is totally different monsters, as many people can attest to. So, yeah. So, anyway, I think like 3/4 of us ended up in 29 Palms. And, where careers and souls go to die in the Marine Corps. Joking aside, looking back on it, after all of my time in, absolutely amazing training facility. Do you want to be stationed there? Absolutely not. But
From a training
yes.
standpoint, amazing. Living life. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so from a combat effectiveness standpoint, it's the largest live fire facility in the entire U.S. military, right? And on top of that, and I'm sure you know this from a public affairs side, it's one of the only facilities, if not the only facility in the military where you can do like true combined arms training with like fixed wing, rotor wing, all the various levels of indirect fire, while you're doing the troop movement and engagement on ground, right? The contact. So it's interesting. But when you're stationed there, you don't care about any of that, right? Like this place is terrible. But yeah, so ended up in 3-7, deployed out of 3-7 with India Company as in the machine gun section, and did a Pacific deployment with those guys based out of Okinawa. A lot of the basic schools like jungle warfare, like all of that stuff. And then came back and 9/11 happened and the world changed, right? Like that was kind of where it was at.
And then, so you got out after 9/11, right after it happened?
Yeah. So actually, it's kind of shocking I didn't get stop loss. So got back from Japan, and at that point in time, and you'll kind of appreciate this, I would say, more so than people nowadays, but this is 2000. You were talking to like lance corporals that we essentially had like 3 deployments under our belt, right? Because we had like 2 RFDS, and then we had like or almost 4, and then a Middle Eastern deployment, an Africa deployment, and then the Pacific. So to the most of the people in the Fleet Marine Force, we were pretty seasoned when the trade towers went down, which is sad to say because we weren't seasoned at all, right? Like so yeah, we trade towers went down. 9/11 happened. I was actually on my way to a grenade range when it occurred, which is another big story. But we knew we were going to war, but we didn't know when. And at that point in time, I was putting in for like law enforcement entities across the nation, and working on my transition out.
Yeah.
And like a lot of really, and I mean, I'll make fun of myself here, like a lot of like really young, stupid Marine NCOs. I was married at the time, first marriage, number one, so, trying to like figure that stuff out. And that was the whole reason I was getting out. I initially wanted to be a career person, and she was kind of freaking out over the whole, like, it's the end of the world stuff. You know what I mean? So yeah, so like I ended up getting out, and then I think I was divorced like 5 months later, joking aside.
Yeah.
But I was living in Huntington Beach, California at the time, like a mile from the beach. And I had moved in with my 2 best friends from the Marines who had gotten out like 4 months prior to me. And we're attending university down there. So I think at that point in time, going through like the divorce and the separation and being out and just transitioning terribly and kind of like failing at life, like a lot of us do, I ended up doing like the couch tour with my buddies in HB, and pretended to go to college there for a while, and then that's how I ended up finding myself in the Army. So
how was that transition into the Army from the Marine Corps? And we won't stay too heavy on that because you have done so much as a veteran and like your veteran and like post, and I really want to focus on that. But I do think it's just always interesting to hear, like, you are somebody who's gone through so many transitions. I think sometimes as service members, we think that there's only the one transition of like when you get out, and it's like transition does not stop. Like there's transition after transition after transition.
So actually that's what I do now, right? Like the company that I work for now is the VP of development beneath the service, the nonprofit. that's what we focus on specifically. We call it the transition following the transition, right? Like, um, we'll come back to that. Anyway, to your question, what was your question again? I'm sorry.
How was the
I got like,
transition
yeah, into the
from
Army,
into the
the
Army?
Marines into
Yeah.
the Army. Yeah. So it was interesting. I was just kind of stumbling through life in California. Just not good at it, man. Like, uh, not, I mean, I was doing okay in school, but I was working a lot of jobs. I was partying a lot, like really, really hard. Um, and just not like really focused. Like the discipline wasn't there. And I had an officer that I stayed in contact with that I was really good friends with that ended up in MARSOC. So, obviously a little laid back, a little different of an attitude than like most of your officers. And anyway, he was like, dude, like stop messing around. Um, Go put a contract in. Like they have like this 18 X-ray program for like Army Special Forces. So like go do this and this and this and see if you can try out. So that was like my initial, I was like, so I can like try out as a civilian. And he was like, yeah, like you don't even have to. And I was like, oh man, where has this been like my entire life? You know what I mean? Like there's no bad right now, right? Like there's no bad. So that's what initially started my interest in the Army. And then the Army being the Army, the recruiters like really pissed me off and kind of pushed me away for a couple of years, right? Because they treated me like I was this like 18-year-old dummy and not like a seasoned, I mean, I don't want to say seasoned, but fairly seasoned NCO, right?
Yeah.
Who had done his time. So I broke contact for a couple of years. They really like pissed me off. And it was because they showed up to my place of employment, which was like really unprofessional after like I sought them out, if that makes sense. Like they
Yes.
kind of just like showed up to get like signatures and stuff. Anyway, um, so like a few years went by and I was like, all right, let's try this again. And at that point in time, I had a really close friend of mine who was from the Naval Special Warfare community. I won't give away too many details because he's currently in law enforcement on the West Coast, but hysterical dude, little short. He's like little short Armenian guy, hysterical, wired really tight. And he was prepping for NSW, Naval Special Warfare. So I started training with him, and then I found out that Special Forces had 19th and 20th Special Forces Group, which were like reserve entities. And I initially tried out for them as a civilian. They have what's called the SFRE, Special Forces Readiness Evaluation. So like I passed that. There was like 5 of us that were selected. They went with out of the 5, 3 of us were Marines, which are tons of jokes there. And then like 2 were like prior like Ranger bat guys. They went with like a prior Force Recon Marine who was trying out, which makes like all the sense. I mean, dude was like a golden egg. He was like Force Recon, had like a degree from like a Cal State in like classic Russian literature. Was like born for like a special forces mission.
Yeah.
So he got the slot, and they were like, hey, you can try out again, or if you guys are really interested, especially for you prior service guys, you might want to just go into the guards. You kind of learn the Army side of the house, right?
Yeah.
Like you learn how we operate. So when you come over to go to school for 2 years or whatever, your mind isn't blown. So, yeah, I ended up saying like, F it. I signed up and I was supposed to go to a LURS D detachment and it closed. It was disbanding 3 months after I joined. So I ended up in like a standard infantry unit, the 160th. I ended up getting pencil whipped into a deployment and the rest was kind of history, right? And I was just kind of like thrown to the wolves. So I think I was in the Army a total of like 4 months before I found myself in like northern Iraq with those yahoos. Pretty cool deployment. But yes, I mean the transition was weird, mainly in terminology, definitely in drill and ceremony. I can say that I had to almost bring like a civilian attitude to it, because, and you'll get this there's just some things that you're not going to be able to change on that side of the house because of the branch, right?
Yeah.
Like
Different
operationally,
cultures. Yeah. Different
correct,
cultures,
correct.
different missions. Just they're, it's different. There's just some things that aren't worth, that also aren't worth the battle of it. Right.
Yeah, correct, correct. So, I mean, there were some hills that I tried to die on, like the Army does close order drill and like full combat kit, which is just the dumbest thing ever. Like, the Marines don't because it weighs like 40 pounds and you're just trying to get from point A to point B.
Why would you
So,
create more injuries?
yeah, like it's just, but no, so I mean, the transition went fairly well. I know that my ego and pride as a Marine that I carried into the Army hurt me a lot. It hurt me on several promotions. It hurt me on like several schools. And that was because there were, I mean, this is terrible because I served with a lot of stellar soldiers. There were a lot of unstellar soldiers that I served with too, right? So I kind of had this, like, I don't want to say chip on my shoulder culturally that I was superior, but I kind of had a chip on my shoulder culturally that I was like superior, right? Um, and I made that comment to one of our first sergeants, and it really kind of chapped his ass because
But
he asked me one day. Go
it's
ahead.
drilled into you as a Marine. Like that's something that like it is a
Yeah, we do. We do better than anybody else, right?
yeah,
Like we
and
do
like
it far better than anybody
and you
else.
have to believe it, right?
Yeah.
Like that's part of it is like they make you believe it and the history and the things that we know and this legacy that I don't think I know for a fact other branches don't even know their legacy the way the Marine Corps does.
Oh yeah,
So
yeah.
like that
We
all
are.
feeds into it. It all feeds
Well,
into
yeah.
that belief.
It feeds into the institutionalization, right?
Yeah.
Of the cult, and that's what we do better than everybody else. To your point.
Yeah.
And I made that statement to our first my old first sergeant. But he was like, he asked me, he's like, "What do you think?" Kind of like not the transition question, but terribly paraphrased, like basically like which branch was better or which branch do you like better or like whatever the case may be. And I basically told him that me being a Marine made me the best soldier in the unit. Um, and he got like really pissed off, but there was like a level of truth to that. But in fairness, I also served in like what that point in time what was considered like a fairly elite unit too, right? So I had a different level of like training, and I would say like my level of word I'm looking for. It'll come to me. Anyway, it made me better to a point, but if I would have like lost my like checked my ego at the door, right, and been like more vested, and I mean I was a little pissed off over some like contractual stuff that was going on, but I mean the transition was pretty good. I can say that I have a bunch of Marine friends that went into the Army. A lot of them went into Special Forces. A few of them went into active duty. My friend Tate, who you should totally talk to, he went into active duty and went through like the Special Forces pipeline and stuff. I think that they would agree that the standards that the Marine Corps places on you um, definitely make you shine in like the other branches, right? And I think that's because in the Marines you have this amount of professionalism and responsibility that's placed on lower enlisted that you don't get in the other branches, right? Like
Yeah.
you don't get it in the Army, you don't get it in the Air Force, you don't get it in the Navy, but you get it in the Marine Corps.
I
So yeah.
But I do love that you said, had you though like taken that chip off your shoulder a little more though, that with that baseline, how that could have, open made the transition into the Army a little easier, made you be
Well,
able to, be even better. I think that is
correct.
again, that moment to be able to reflect on that because it's not easy in those times of like transition and doing things. It's not like It's not easy. Like, it's easy to think back and be like, oh, I could have done this different, right? Like, so just a note for people
Well,
as they're listening to take that kind of advice.
well, agreed. And ultimately, like to your point, that's what I learned in college, right? Like when people were like, "What did you learn in college?" Right? Because like people are like, "Oh, spending your money on college is a waste of money," or like you're being indoctrinated, or whatever the case may be. Realistically, um, I learned to think outside of the box more, right, and approach things like way more objectively. And but also while also trying to be results oriented, and that's the Marine side of me is okay, well, maybe my way is not the best way, but what is the best way that's going to get us to point A or point B? And to your point earlier, dropping that ego, that's part of the transition, right? Like, and I'll catch a lot of grief for this, but it's like the people that serve 4 years, or whatever the case may be, that they're 50 years old and they still talk like they're a Lance Corporal, right? Like, I mean, not that there's anything wrong with that, but you've had a successful business, you're a parent, you know what I mean, you've done X, Y, or Z. There's so many things that you've done that are greater in various aspects, right, than just like your 4 years of service may have been, right? Does that make sense?
It
So
does.
and to that point, like, to your point, like, you did public affairs in the Marine Corps, but then you came out and you worked for the feds and you started a podcast, and, you tried to break down like the hiring process and, help transition veterans and do this and this and this. And I think you're a mother, right? And, so you have all of these various aspects that are huge parts of your personality. The Marine Corps is a portion of that, and maybe a very important portion of that, but not the key portion. So that's kind of what I do at Beneath the Service now, or we do at Beneath the Service, is we focus on like the transition after the transition, if that makes sense. But more specifically, recently we've taken over the Women Veterans Leadership Program, and that's the I think the thing that's most interesting that we're doing is, we're working with arguably the fastest growing demographic in the United States, within the veteran community, and within the military community. So, it's really important for us to continue and I'm going to sound really uneducated as a Marine here, and kind of as an Army infantry guy. I didn't work with females until I got into law. The Marine Corps at that point in time was very good at keeping the Marine Corps segregated by sex, almost. Like,
It was.
If you were in the combat arms side, so you think tanks, artillery, infantry, I mean, even motor T, we had our separate infantry motor T guys, right? Like within the battalions that were attached. It was an all boys club. And like, I remember, and I'm not going to say I'm like happy about it. It is what it is, right? But like, I remember when we would run to certain sides of bases or go to certain installations on deployments or layovers on deployments, that our cadences would have to change, right? Because of like the vernacular that was definitely deemed offensive at the time, and so, like all of that kind of changed for me, like, and the military's changed as a whole. And I mean, that's, it's not good nor bad. It just, kind of is what it is. And, for me to be part of that was really kind of weird and eye-opening as well. Right. So
It's so cool that you're being such a big part of it on this end of it. Like you said, like, it's not like while you were in serving, it's like it's from the other end. How is that to see that, and for me, I joined when females were only going to Paris Island, and
fourth battalion.
Yeah, fourth battalion.
Yeah.
When fourth battalion disbanded, Papa Company, when fourth battalion disbanded, like there was a moment of like, okay, well, I can feel these emotions of being sad because that's my history. Like, there was a beautiful thing of being taught by female Marines and being surrounded by female Marines. But at the same time, it was like, but this integration is so important because there's so many perceptions and so many things that, because of that segregation, that the integration. And, one of my best friend in the Marine Corps, she was able to be on, the augment team for women in the infantry. And she was, a mortarman and did the trials. And to see that while it's just history, and to see the Marine Corps evolving and changing. Like, change isn't always a bad thing. Like, we have to change, right? War changes,
Well,
everything changes.
it does. And I mean, I tell people ultimately at the end of the day, like we all have an opinion on it, but people with that far more experience in the matters than I are making the decisions, right? So, as somebody that served the country and comes from, I would say, a family that has served generationally, and I'm not going to say I agree with all of our leaders' decisions, right? But like ultimately, we're supposed to trust those decisions to an extent, and until they prove otherwise, it is what it is. And I mean, there's tons of arguments to be made, but like I said, far above my pay grade. So,
And I'm all for it. Like, conversations are great, but I think what's
mhm.
interesting is, or I guess what I want to ask is, how did you get into what you do now and making an impact on this side? What was like the driving force of that?
Oh man. So I've been in the veteran advocacy space for almost a decade. So the driving force for mine was an injury that I sustained that I kind of knew about, but didn't pay attention to, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
um, I was hit by a couple of roadside bombs on my last deployment, and just being a grunt, an infantry dude, and being in air assault units, and then training for SF with like a pack and all this stuff. Like my spine was just shot.
Mm.
So when I was in Arizona, I had to have basically like an emergency spinal surgery due to injury sustained in the service. And while I was sitting at home, like popping, biking, and feeling sorry for myself, right? Because like my career is over, like I'm not going to be able to do this in law enforcement anymore. And, what I got my degree in and what I wanted to do, I'm not going to be able to do anymore. And, like we just relocated to Arizona from California, and, like the whole woe is me, and, all of this. And I got hit up by a friend of mine from high school who had gone in the Marine Corps and had done some contracting work, maybe with Blackwater or Triple Canopy. But anyway, he had hit me up, and he was like, "Hey, you have a degree in like policy, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, yeah." And he's like, "You volunteer a lot," and I'm like, "Well, yeah, yeah, I try when I can." And he was like, "Hey, dude, you should meet with the field representative from our organization." Because of all the stuff that's going on in the VA right now, right? And this is like, like 2013, 2014, like right when the scandal in Phoenix was getting ready to pop with the secret wait list, and like all this stuff was getting ready to happen, right? So I was like, yeah, I don't know, man. And he was like, hey, dude, you might be able to come back and see your family. And he was like, free trip, and I was like, oh, like you're selling me, like you're selling me on this organization. So, um, anywho, he was like, well, he goes, at least have him take you out to lunch. And he's like, make him take you somewhere nice. And I started laughing. I was like, all right, fair enough. So I met this dude named Matt Dobson. He's awesome. 101st combat medic, phenomenal, phenomenal dude, firefighter out here, small business owner, entrepreneur. But he's working for Concerned Veterans for America at the time, which was a center to right leaning policy organization. So I make him take me to this like super nice seafood restaurant because I don't know, right? Right? Like I was like, well, Jacob told me to do it. Like, F it, I'm going to do it, right? I'm going to get like my surf and turf out of the deal. So anyway, he was just asking me about my experience at the VA, which at that point in time was terrible because I couldn't get through the red tape to get seen. Like a lot of veterans, I just didn't speak the language, right? And like a lot of stubborn Marines and infantry guys and enlisted, I get like really frustrated because I didn't speak the language, and it would turn into this huge ordeal. So anyway, he comes out. He was like, "Hey, would you be willing to tell your stories?" Because I use private care to fix myself, is where we were going with this. Would you be willing to tell the story to Senator McCain? And I was like, "Well, yeah, man. Like, I don't care. Whatever. That'll work." So we ended up, my wife and I ended up in Washington, D.C. for this thing called Vets on the Hill at the time, Concerned Veterans for America. This was in 2015, I want to say. And yeah, so we were just meeting with the representatives talking about our issues that we were having with the VA. There was like 350 veterans there. It was like really kind of special, cool to be part of and really learn, because you forget that when you get out of school, after you take that one semester of civics in high school, right? How involved that you can be in our political process if you want to be. And that's what makes our country amazing. That's a different podcast too, right? So
Yeah.
anyway, but yeah, so I kind of fell in love with it. And so we did this huge lobby sesh, and my wife was like, wouldn't it be cool if you could do this? And, I'm like the sleeved Marine guy. I'm like, me in politics, that's hysterical. And then my mom kind of said the same thing. And I'm like, that's hysterical. And, fast forward, I volunteered with him for about a year. That turned into me working as like a wait, there's more, like a field guy, like here's a brochure, sign up. I ended up promoting all the way up to like number 3 of the organization a year ago, or 3 years ago. So I was running 16 states. And by that point in time, we had helped pass the VA Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act. We had helped pass and helped get the Whistleblower's Office established. We had helped pass the VA Mission Act and helped craft that, which for female veterans, to me, was a huge win, because it allowed you ladies to get seen out in the community instead of waiting like 6 months for an OB, which if my wife had to, she would kill somebody.
Yeah.
So, so I kind of fell in love with it. And then I got out of CVA about a year ago. And anyway, I ended up with Beneath the Service, which is this amazing nonprofit that doesn't work on the policy side of the house, but works specifically on leadership training. They've grandfathered over the Women Veterans Leadership Program from the Mission Continues, so that's ours now. So we're going into year 8 for 2025. So that's our big focus, is we're starting to shift toward the women's leadership demographic. But we also just do veterans leadership, right? And that's because we know the amount of leadership that we have that is a translatable skill. But having said that, what separates us is the CEO and founder and co-founder. They're a West Point couple, both officers, amazing, Leo and Nikki, and highly educated. And they take a data-driven approach, right? Like Leo's finishing up his doctorate in Columbia. And, with that data, you can extrapolate the fact that there's only so many demographics that become institutionalized in their lifetimes, right? Out of those demographics, ones are the prison population, right? Which it is what it is. And then the other big one is the veteran population. And that's because you live there, you essentially do become institutionalized, and the Marines are the worst about it out of all of the branches because of our cult-like nature. So to your point, we work on the transition after the transition, breaking down that identity and letting you know that, like, hey, to your point and to what we were discussing later, like, yes, you're a veteran. Yes, you should be proud of it. It's so important. Like, you should be proud of your service. But you're a dad or a wife. You're a mom. You're a community leader. You're doing all of, and that's really what our philosophy tries to incorporate, is that real leadership is about becoming yourself through knowing who you are, right? And that's like our focal point when we are trying to help veterans and their families understand like their identity and how that impacts their reintegration. Does that kind of make sense?
That makes complete sense. And I think is so powerful when, like, just again, that transition doesn't stop. And our stories are so important, but our stories are not just this one moment in time, right?
Mhm.
Like our stories go so beyond. And I think we may need to have like a bonus episode where maybe we talk about that a little deeper and what you guys are doing, because somehow we are already at 52 minutes.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to
I
be
don't
back
know
on.
how. I have
Yeah, yeah,
thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Before I ask the
absolutely.
last question, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you want to make sure we bring up?
I would say, there was a question where you kind of asked about like my time in and like the adversities that I faced and that we didn't go over. Um, I'd say that the adversities that I faced were culture shock within the military with other cultures, right? Being from like small town USA and you meet the dude from New York that has the accent that you can't understand, or you're breaking down barriers because you're just illiterate, right, on like the lifestyles that these other cultures have lived. And I think that was something that we had to kind of overcome. And I think you can kind of attest to that because when you go through the Marine Corps, it starts with like where you went to boot camp, and then what coast are you from, and then like what town are you from, and then like that's how your cliques kind of form up. And then usually by the end of your enlistment or like 2 years, none of that shit matters anymore, right? Like you're just kind of like hanging out with anybody. So I think that was like the adversity aspect. And then the overview of the time in, I mean, obviously I loved it, right? Like I was a glutton for punishment. I went back into the guard. So I mean, I would tell people listening, jump on your podcast, share your stories. I think that's important. It's important for everybody, and I mean, it's really important for our kids because it's probably stuff that we're never going to talk about around them. So,
And that was one of the driving forces. It was like, I know that like us talking to each other, veteran to veteran, Marine to Marine, we're going to share things that we probably wouldn't with our kids. However, this is now
mhm.
digitized and our children and grandchildren and great grandchildren have the opportunity to hear a piece of our stories that maybe they wouldn't have heard. And I
Mhm.
say that because I had the privilege to be my grandfather's guardian on an honor flight. My grandfather did not talk about his service. That day I saw him cry for the first time. He talked about his
Yeah,
service.
yeah,
And from that, he shared with the whole family things we never would have known.
yeah,
And so there's power in sharing your story. There is true power. And I cannot thank you enough for coming on and sharing a piece of your story. And I will definitely be
yeah.
bringing
Sure,
you back, bringing you back on because I feel like we didn't even like touch the surface of things. But since we only have
sure,
a few minutes left, I will ask the last question, which is if you had to
sure.
take the oath again, would you?
Oh man, I get asked that a lot actually because I have two little boys. They put me on the spot. Absolutely. I don't think. I mean, I love our country. It's having been all over the world, and I mean, maybe I don't know. There's just no place greater than the United States, and I mean, I can definitely say that we don't hit home runs on everything, but um, we hit home runs on most stuff. And being able to serve something higher than yourself and being part of something higher than yourself, um, pre-war, during war, post-war is just something amazing that I think everybody should be part of, right? Without being conscripted. So, absolutely, yeah, I would